might say yes, maybe they might say no, or whatever. But yeah, I got a response about this right away. Please let us publish it. I figured that. So anyway, that felt really, really good. Yeah. But anyway, this is one of the funnest projects I've ever done. And yeah, the response has just been amazing.
So you were familiar already to some extent with Kayama's work, and I feel like he kind of gets overlooked a lot in the scheme of people talk about Honda, Maka, and Tsuburaya, but really Kayama doesn't get brought up very much. So if you were to like kind of give an elevator pitch for like what his whole autorial field is, how would you explain it to people who haven't heard of his work?
Yeah, you're totally right. That especially in all the English language scholarship and writing about Godzilla, his name is almost never mentioned. And so when I realized I think he was involved with the original Godzilla, I'm like, wait, but there's something wrong here. There's something wrong with the way that we've written the history of the 1954 movie that started it all. So Kayama was a writer who, during World War II, he was actually an economist and was working for the Japanese Ministry of Finance. So he was working in a completely different field. He loved literature, he loved to write. And soon after World War II ended, he was never sent to war, but I think he had strong feelings about the war. After the war ended, there was an explosion in popular literature in Japan. During the wartime era, there was such strict, heavy censorship that people got immediately bored with all this kind of right-wing nationalistic stuff that was being produced like crazy during the war. So after 1945, and paper became available again, after the paper shortages of the war were ended, there was an explosion of popular magazines that was just incredible. And one of the magazines that was founded during this time was a magazine called Koseki, usually translated as The Jewel. And this became like the foremost vehicle in immediate post-war Japan for adventure stories, especially like young boys' adventure tales out in the South Pacific, detective fiction, and science fiction. So it was orangutan, like little tiny people in Indonesia. So he this theme of going out into the world, especially the South Pacific, and finding unknown creatures, something that we definitely see again in Godzilla, right? So there's certain themes that carry through in his work. He's incredibly prolific. By the time that the producers at Toho Studios had the idea of making a movie of the radioactive monster, he was publishing something like 40 pieces per year. So he was really like at his height. And so he was tapped into Toho Studios as a popular, very prolific, and also very fast-working author to be part of his project. I think maybe people might know the story of the 1954 Godzilla. I'm not getting too far off topic here. But in 1954, the idea for this movie came around March of that year. And the movie was completed in the theaters in November that same year. An incredibly quick turnaround, unbelievably fast by modern standards, unthinkable by modern standards, right? So there was such a quick turnaround for the first Godzilla project that they needed someone who could write quickly, and Kayama was their guy. So yeah, that's what we can call.
It makes sense, and the sequel was also 6 months after the original.
Right, yeah, absolutely. So in November, almost as soon as it hit the theaters, it was a massive blockbuster right out of the gate. People were lining up around the Shigeki Theater to get tickets. Literally around the theater multiple times with lines. Toho realized that okay, we hit the jackpot on this one, and so they immediately greenlighted a sequel. And so Kayama was tapped, and within like the course of 10 days or something like that, he wrote the sequel. So that's all the way together, which came out 6 months after the first film. Again, unthinkable turnaround by modern standards.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Cool story.
So you are a very experienced translator, and you've translated a number of other works by Japanese authors before you did this project. I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges in translating a work like this? Both in terms of the differences in language, but maybe culture or, assumptions or, anything along those lines, even maybe story arc might be different.
Yeah, that's a really good question and a big question, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. Boy, where to start? There are definitely a lot of differences between the Japanese language and English, of course. Some of them are at the level of kind of word choice and grammatical kind of issues. Like, for instance, in Japanese, there are a number of things that we don't have in English, like extremely polite language that kind of is marked by the social relationship between the speakers. Like, for instance, if you just read the text of the speech alone, you can easily tell about the gender of the speaker. You can easily tell about the age of the speaker and the social relationships to one another. So things like that are not necessarily easy to reproduce in English. So there are often those kind of cultural challenges. There are also some other kind of like interesting issues, like about the Japanese language. For instance, Japanese, you can avoid the discussion of gender of a person so easily. You never have to use a pronoun if you know who you're talking about. So there's never anywhere in this entire book, ever, not even once, a pronoun used to refer to Godzilla. So there's no indication whatsoever anywhere in the text at all whether Godzilla is male, female, hermaphroditic, or somehow non-binary in some other fashion. And so that was something that I realized I had to decide: is Godzilla going to be it, he or she or a they or what? And so that was one of the most interesting problems that I had with this text, thinking about the gender of Godzilla. I know that Toho Studios, well, their official answer is Godzilla is in it, and it's not necessarily gendered in one way or the other, but that's not the way that we talk about Godzilla in popular culture. So I had to think about those kind of things as well. It's a really interesting kind of question. Yeah. As a gay man myself, I wanted to. My first inclination was to avoid gender altogether and to refer to Godzilla as it. But the editor did not like that. The editor is like, and my students at Western too, when I showed them the first draft, they're like, no, Godzilla has way too much personality here to be referred to as it all the time. So yeah, we had those kind of interesting discussions in class. So I have to give a shout out to the students at Western who helped to guide me in some of these thinking here.
Students rarely, steer you wrong. And one other comment too, what you were saying about the differences in Japanese grammar and sentence construction and lack of pronoun use, if you know what you're talking about. If you've ever used Google Translate between English and Japanese, if you dump Japanese into Google Translate and you get something back, and it's like, what the heck is this? Or the auto-translate that you get on Facebook, it's just absurdly weird. And a lot of that is because it's not discerning. It wants to plop in pronouns when there are no pronouns, right? So even if someone else is being talked about, will usually default on I. I think this, I saw that word. In fact, that's entirely not what's going on. So if you've ever run into that frustration, that this is part of what's going on.
Definitely. Yeah, don't trust Google Translate. I know this guy's working hard on the software, but
Another quirk of this book is I've never read another prose book that has so many onomatopoeias and sound effects. Like, how did you deal with that?
That was really fun. Like in the scenes where like Godzilla is stomping through Tokyo, like here I opened to page 73 randomly, and here we have the sound of a train running through, going wheek, wheek, blowing its whistle. Underneath that screech, as the train puts on its brakes, and then boom, crash, crash, and then as Godzilla roars over. Like the amount of onomatopoeias on a single page at some point, it's like at some point it's just almost like ridiculous by modern standards. And it makes it feel like very much like you're reading a comic book in prose. And at first I wondered, there's a part of me that thought, should I try to tone that down a little bit? But no, that's like part of the original style of this book. It's filled with sound. And I think that was one of his ways, Kayama's ways of kind of making the text come alive. And I like that a lot about this text. And it makes it quirky and fun. Yeah, actually, I had some trouble like when working with all the ideas because in Japanese there's a million more words to refer to ideas than English. Like there's a specific sound that is used over and over in this book, like the sound of metal crumpling. In Japanese, it's many. And so if you see that written on the page, you know, okay, here's like something like a car or a building getting crushed together. And of course, that happens a lot. Godzilla stomp, right? So that sound appears all over the place. Like, how do you represent that sound in English? Ooh. The roars of the kaiju were pretty fun. In Japanese, at least in the book version here, his roar is wow. So, like, how do you spell that in English? Yeah. But I decided to put like an R at the end of it to make it look more like a roar. Like, rawr, I don't know. I thought that would work better in English. And Iris, in the second part, his roar is in Japanese, whoa. And I was like, okay, now how do you write that on the page? And it doesn't look like, whoa. There's some fun challenges as well.
So one of the things that I think is really fascinating about reading your translation, certainly of Godzilla, but also Godzilla Raised Again, but I think Godzilla, because that's what the movie that sort of comes to mind, is that there are some really fascinating differences between what we might remember from the movie and what goes on in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe share your thoughts on what the reasons might be for those differences.
And that was, again, like the differences between the book and the film were one of the reasons that I became so interested in this. I'm like, this is one of the reasons we have to bring this book into English, just to show what Kayama's vision of the story was. In the book, one of the things that people immediately notice is that the character of Ogata, who is the central protagonist of the film, like he's kind of a secondary character in the book. And his role is kind of taken over by the character of Shinkichi. If you remember the film, he's the young boy who's wearing a hat who came from Odo Island and whose family was killed. So he basically performs all of the kind of work that Ogata does in the novel. For the most part, Ogata still exists in the novel, but his role is much diminished. So like the romance that exists between Ogata and Emiko, the female character, is then transposed onto this younger Shinkichi character. It turns out in the book version that Emiko and Shinkichi, that boy, were evacuated into the mountains during World War II, and that they had some past history. They became friends at that point during the worst years of World War II, and so then later on when they meet again, there's this old kind of rekindling of friendship. So there's a lot of interesting kind of differences like that, and why did Kayama do that? I'm not sure that we have like a definitive answer, but it's clear that when he was writing this novella, he wanted to write it for a young adult audience. He wanted young adults to read his book because he felt like the anti-nuclear message that was embedded in this text, he wanted to send that to the next generation. He wanted to create a new generation of people that would stand up and oppose the use of nuclear weapons. So it was really, I think, important for him to refocus all of the action on a younger audience, like the audience he was trying to reach with the story. I might just mention too that Kayama really conceived this book very much as an anti-nuclear protest. When he wrote the original screenplay for Toho Studios, he suggested that at the very beginning of 1954 Godzilla, that they started a whole series of shots related to historical footage, related to the bomb, to the Castle Bravo bombings in the Marshall Islands. He wanted to show images of the Lucky Dragon number 5, the unlucky boat that had happened to be irradiated by the bomb, and that started like this kind of nuclear panic in coastal Japan. He really wanted to kind of tie the story very directly to these historical events. The Toho Studios is like, no, can't do that. If we show like actual real historical footage at the beginning of the film that is going to kind of set a too somber road for the movie, and so they axed that. So
It's already kind of somber.
it's already, totally. So yeah. But Kayama, I think that he was a little bit unpleased by the fact that his strong anti-nuclear messaging is toned down, and so he really wanted to kind of repackage the story and deliver it to a younger audience. So.
Yeah, another addition for the book that I've always found kind of interesting is this subplot with the Tokyo Godzilla Society. It's really wild. I'm trying to unpack a little bit of what's going on there, and if you have share your insights on that one.
Yeah, I have to admit that when I read this in Japanese for the first time, and so in the story, the book version, there is suddenly, as Godzilla's knocking through Tokyo, this group that emerges calling themselves the Tokyo Godzilla Society, and they start putting up posters all over Tokyo saying, "Oh, your time is near. The great god Godzilla is going to be stomping through. Watch out!" And this is kind of introduced without any real explanation, and I won't tell you what happens with that little subplot, but I was so perplexed by this. I have to think, I don't know if they're fans of the film, the anime Akira here. Classic, yeah. But there's in that anime, there is a cult that appears, and as soon as the kind of monstrous Akira appears, they begin to worship him. So, I can't prove it, but I'm convinced that plot line came from the story. And that was Mark from Godzilla. He had the appearance of a gigantic, horrifying, destructive monster would cause people to take religious turn.
I would absolutely agree. The actors have a lot of post-war imagery throughout the whole story.
So if people, maybe they like this book, what other books would you recommend if they wanted to continue their summer reading projects?
I think actually you would be a good person to answer that question. I've been enjoying the MMAs, by Yamamoto Yoshi. I haven't read the English translation, but I think that there's a translation of the first book.
Nathan Collins.
Nathan Collins? Okay, yeah, thanks. So there's a 3-volume set of stories, published in Japanese. I think the first volume is being translated into English, of modern kaiju stories. So I think that's one really exciting text. It's not out yet, but I'm working on another project right now. Which I
Do tell.
yes. I don't know if any people who might have been involved with this is in this room, but when this came out, I guess the University of Minnesota Press was flooded by emails saying, "Thank you for publishing this book. We want you to do the Luminous Fairies and Mothra React." Thank you. Because the press immediately wrote to me and they're like, "Hey, would you be interested in doing this?" And I'm like, "Hell yeah!" And so that's I just got word 2 days ago, the day of the opening ceremonies, that was greenlighted.
Yeah.
So we finally Luminous Fairies and Mothra was the basis of the movie. The book came first. And it's very different than the movie in some interesting ways, but it hasn't been in English yet. So we got the permission to do it. It's written by 3 authors. It's a very strange book. One person wrote the beginning part, and he passed it off to his friend who wrote the middle, and someone else wrote the ending. So it's a very quirky book that's kind of like sutured together. But really weird. It's even weirder than the movie. So, I've been working on that, and so I got permission from all 3 of the rights holders to do that. One of the rights holders took a really long time to respond, and so I was panicked. I'm like, "Oh, this is gonna happen. This is gonna happen." Fest energy. I sent it out to the university. So.
Is there a timeline for publication?
So just because it was just officially greenlighted, like just a couple days ago, I haven't heard the official timeline yet. But I finished the translation. I'm working the afterword right now. So I don't think it's not too far over this now. Let's say maybe a year from now.
So at next year's Honey Fest, we could be talking about that.
Yeah. Would it be okay to read like a little passage from it? Yeah. So here's about 1/3 of the way through the book, there's a long passage in which one of the characters is in Infant Islands, and he hears about all the local mythology of Infant Islands, about where Mothra comes from, about where the luminous fairies come from, and so on. And none of that appears in the movie, so it's just all great fun. So anyway, so this is the mythology that appears in the book. Long ago, when this world was still chaotic and undefined, the first being to appear was the god Ajima, who ruled over eternal night. He took the things which muddy the world and flow along, things like mist and clouds, and pushed the ones with heavy moisture downward, while lifting the light ones high above. And that way, the sea and the sky were born. Ajima then lifted something heavy from the bottom of the sea, the ground, in other words, and created 2 islands. Exhausted from all this work, Ajima lay down on the island that was nothing but sand. Before long, he was fast asleep and snoring. From his snoring, thunder, violent wind, and tsunamis were born. On the islands ruled by this god, eternal night prevailed. He had created the sky, sea, and islands, but he quickly found himself bored, so he split his own body down the middle. The right half of his body was reborn in the same form as before, becoming the same god, Ajima, who he had always been. The left half, however, was reborn as the goddess Ajigo. The goddess Ajigo ruled over the daytime. She created the sun. She breathed over the land, the grass, the trees, the birds, and beasts were born. When she breathed over the sea, fish and other creatures of the sea were born as well. Out of a sense of rivalry, the god Ajima created the moon and the stars. However, the two found themselves worn out from all the work of creation, so eventually they lay down together to sleep. Before long, a gigantic egg was born from their intimacy. Unlike the things which the god and goddesses had each created on their own, this egg was born from both of them, so it had characteristics of both day and night. It shone like the sun and glowed like the moon. The egg was called Mothra, but it did not hatch, no matter how long they waited. Next, a male and female couple were born from Ajima and Ajigo. Using their own abilities, the humans began to gradually increase the number until the entire island was overflowing with humanity. Next, a gigantic number of extremely tiny eggs were born from the god and goddess. These eggs glittered like stars. The eggs turned into larvae, chrysalises, and into moths which flitted out of the air. The male god became convinced that it had been a mistake on the part of the female goddess to give birth to so many tiny eggs, and so he flew into a rage. He cast death down upon the world. He cast it down upon everything, upon humanity, the birds, the beasts, the fish, and the beasts, killing half of everything. Ajima was still so furious that he broke his body into 4 pieces. The island rumbled and parts of it collapsed. The 4 parts of his body flew into the sky, joining the dawn stars, the night stars, the northern stars, and the southern stars in the heavens. The goddess was despondent. As she lamented, she had decided to offer her own body as a living sacrifice to Mothra, the egg of the infinite. So she came before it and split her body into 4 parts, and thus died. From these 4 parts, however, 4 tiny young girls were born, each less than half the height of an ordinary human being. Their entire bodies glowed, even in the middle of the night. These tiny creatures were called Airena, and as maidens in the service of Mothra, the egg of the infinite, they had eternal life. When the larvae that had hatched previously from the countless small eggs formed their own cocoons, they took the thread from the cocoons and wove it into clothing for themselves. The threads in that clothing also glowed like phosphorus in the night. Before she died, the goddess Ajigo uttered a prophecy. The Airena, these 4 fairies, will serve Mothra, and Mothra will be sure to protect this island. a movie to find, identical twins than it is to find identical quadruplets. So, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Now I want an audiobook.
Oh, by the way, so I just, not too long ago, I got word that this is being turned into an audiobook. It sounded great. It's not me. It's not much better.
Gosh, that was really exciting and really, really intriguing. Sets up some things that are very different from what we might expect. So, and the tone is really fantastic. So, well, I think at this point we have about 10 minutes left, so this might be a good time to ask if anyone has any questions. I saw that hand go up in the back first.
Are there any other works of Japanese science fiction or fantasy that you'd like to see translated?
Oh my gosh, there are mountains. There are mountains. There is a wonderful science fiction writer by the name of Komatsu Sakyo. That's his name in the Japanese order. He was one of the most prolific of Japanese science fiction writers. He published, more than 100 novels in his lifetime, including, many really fascinating kaiju stories. One of the very, very best pieces of kaiju fiction I've ever read is a piece that he wrote called Ade, that thing. And it turns out that the kaiju that is attacking humanity is an embodiment of history itself. It's a really kind of fantastic conceptual work, and I'm trying to convince a publisher to it. Yeah, so there's lots of good stuff out there. So much. Again, science fiction is one of the most neglected fields in transmission. I don't know why that is, but I think all these serious scholars, they look into this as one of the
Second row here.
Oh.
Yes,
Yeah.
Let's repeat the question first. So the question was if you have any plans to translate any of the more recent novelizations of Godzilla films published in Japan.
So I don't have a specific plan, but I'm trying to convince a press right now. I'm not going to say anything too much about it because it's not set yet. But there's a particular press that I'm trying to convince to do a big anthology of kaiju-related stories. And if we're able to do that, I think I'd like to take a selection of stories that are both kind of the classic ones, that were related to the Toho films and so on, and even some older things. There are things that predate Toho. I'd love to include some of those things along with some of the newer works like Single Points or maybe some excerpts from those things. But yeah, there's so much out there. I was just in Japan for the first half of the summer, and I had to buy another suitcase because I bought so many related books. So there's so much out there. It's just insane. I'm hoping that if there are more translators here, that will look busy. There's a lot to do.
Third row here. Raise your hand.
So, you touched on something earlier that I wanted to ask about. You mentioned the quirky nature of the writing style when you were translating the original text. I have read dozens of Japanese translated science fiction works by various authors going back decades and decades, and which, as you mentioned, is hard to find, so we need more. But I've noticed a consistent thing with each one that I would read, more often than not. They all have this almost very quirky, and dare I say, almost amateurish style to them. Where I read it, I'm like, did this come out of a teenager's fan fiction? It's like, but it's supposed to be a world, a Japanese renowned, best-selling author. And to me, in English, in the translation, it feels quaint at best.
Yeah,
And my question is that simply the difference between the acceptable style of Japanese writing versus what we consider, professionalism in English, or is that an after effect of trying to translate one language into another that they just can't seem to, mesh with each other so well?
Yeah, wow, that's a really big question. Did people hear the question? It was about the style of Japanese science fiction. A reader here was saying that he felt that early Japanese science fiction in particular didn't feel perhaps as professional as some science fiction written in the States or elsewhere. I definitely know where you're coming from. I think that it's probably it was really only about the late 1960s and 1970s in Japan that science fiction, I think, was really considered a serious genre, like a serious genre for, not just for young readers, not just for adolescent readers, but for readers of, all ages. And I think probably something similar happened in this country as well, where, like science fiction entered a kind of more adult phase in the 1960s and 70s. But, and because so much of the early Japanese science fiction writing in particular was for kind of popular and kind of pulpy, even in magazines, I think that a lot of it was kind of done very quickly, written for financial gain, rather than necessarily for the art of the entire experience. But that's definitely changed. Since the 1970s onward, I think that the extremely high level of writing that we have for science fiction in Japan has been wonderful. There is also a thing too, like we were kind of alluding to it a little bit earlier, that science fiction unfortunately hasn't been treated as seriously as a genre by academic scholars, and a lot of my colleagues in the world of Japanese literature studies, football, which is, I think, is their loss, my gain. But so I think that sometimes some of those kind of prejudices against particular genres mean that it's not always necessarily the people who have a lot of experience translating or doing the translations you might end up reading. So that might be part of it as well.
Thank you.
It's a really big question.
Seen this hand up here for a while.
I just was curious about the timeline of the books going to the movies. Were the books written before, or was he hired to write them?
Yeah. Okay. So that's really actually a complex point. So Kayama was hired to write the scenario for Godzilla. So he sat down, and it said that he drafted the entire story, the Godzilla story, that more or less what we know today. There are a lot of small changes. But he drafted the story that we know today in the course of about a week. He worked incredibly quickly. And so he turned over the scenario to Toho Studios. So we do have a copy. We do have the scenario. It's available in print in Japan. I couldn't get permission to translate it from Toho, unfortunately. But the scenario that he wrote is kind of half story and half just dialogue. So it kind of looks like a movie script with bits of stories stuck into it. So that was kind of the original form of Godzilla. That's known in English usually as the G project scenario. So that was the kind of first iteration that he was involved with. Then there was a second iteration. There was a radio drama that was serialized in 12 installments, just as a kind of PR move for the film. It was aired in the late 1954 in preparation for the film. And I think the idea was to get everyone excited. Ooh, what does this monster look like? We have to go to the theaters to go see what Godzilla looks like. And it worked like mad. People, the tickets sold out immediately in 1954 as soon as the film came out. So then there was the radio drama. So that was the second kind of iteration of Godzilla. There was also a third iteration that I only just recently found out about in kind of some pulpy magazines. I think that Shigeru's scenario was then adapted by some other person for this form. And then finally, this is kind of like a fourth iteration, where he sat down and he wrote his own version, his own vision of the Godzilla story from beginning to end.
Yeah, so quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Is that Godzilla and Godzilla right?
Yes. Yeah, so in this book, we got both the plots of the first and second movies. So, yeah.
And is that being sold anywhere?
Yeah, it's being sold in the autograph room. I brought a big stack of them. I don't want to take them back home. So I'm just selling them for the cover price. I'm not asking for anything else. So it's actually cheaper than Amazon on Church's Hill stats.
All right, we're just about out of time, so one last question.
Oh, well, okay, I've got to say that I love the old movies. I love the old show era movies. You know, I fell in love with them as a kid. You know, like watching them and all the quirky backgrounds, the kind of mid-century modern furniture and stuff like that. I just loved it. You know, I think one of my favorite ones in the old Godzilla universe is Godzilla vs. Toho. You know, which is like one of the weirdest, strangest, most psychedelic, ones. I love it because of its wonderful look, and also its environmental messaging as well. So I just love the old movies. And the new movies are great too. I mean, I was blown away by Godzilla -1. I just couldn't believe it. I was so overwhelmed when I see it. But I just have a special affection in my heart for this old movies.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on here. Thank you so much.